was a little girl and I got upset, I chose to be alone, especially if I knew I had done something wrong. I often went out into the garden to think things over, sometimes crying or crossly kicking up the grass. My mum told me years later, as she watched me through the window, she knew I was upset. Mum wisely gave me time and space to calm down. She wisely knew that reconciliation had to be meaningful. I needed to be ready to listen, talk, and find a way forward. In other words, I needed to say sorry and mean it. When we make mistakes and are hurting, angry and upset, we may react in different ways. We may be confrontational. Our response might be, I'm really angry. We might want to fight and take on the world. We may try to shift the blame. Our response might be, it wasn't me, he did it. The dog ate my homework scenario. We may be in denial. Our response might be, it's nothing to do with me. Finding forgiveness and reconciliation can be very hard work. To fail forward and be renewed takes time, space, and lots of love. Time, space, and love were really important in the story of Peter's renewal. One terrible night. Peter's terrible night started in the Olive Grove garden when his friend Jesus was arrested. Soldiers and officials had come for Jesus with torches, lanterns, and weapons. In the chaos, Peter stood up for Jesus and cut off Malchus' ear. Malchus was the high priest's servant. Peter took the route of confrontation. But at that moment, Jesus rebuked him. Jesus told him that the way of suffering had to be the way forward. I don't think Peter really understood and was confused. Jesus was then bound, arrested, and taken to the high priest's house. Peter and another disciple followed, probably in the shadows to avoid their own capture. The terrible night progressed. Peter moved from the garden into enemy territory, the courtyard of the high priest's house. Inside the house, Jesus, whom Peter believed to be God's chosen one, the Messiah, was being questioned by the high priest. As Peter stood outside in the cold, he may have heard the angry voices of the high priest and the sound of physical violence when Jesus was slapped on his face during the interrogation. In addition to Jesus' identity being questioned, the servants in the courtyard wanted to know who Peter was. On that cold night, standing around the fire, Peter was asked twice, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" Peter was given a scenario that expected an answer of, "No, I'm not one of his disciples." After all, if a leader is arrested, why would his followers want to come to the enemy's house? Peter denied his allegiance to Jesus a third time, when it felt like the truth was nearer to being exposed. A servant may have heard from his relative a description of the man who'd cut off his ear. in the dark and gloom of the night, perhaps that servant thought Peter fitted the description. We may feel sympathy for Peter at this point. His world was being turned upside down, and his own life was potentially in danger. Peter was not arrested on that terrible night, but in the hazy light of dawn, a cock crowed, bringing in a new day. At that moment, we can only wonder how painful it was for Peter to remember the promise that he'd made to follow Jesus. He'd previously told his friend he would give him everything. But Jesus had challenged him and told him he would disown him. In John chapter 13, Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. On that terrible night, Peter experienced a range of emotions and reacted in different ways. It was a night of fighting, following in the shadows, shock, fear, taking the path of least resistance, denial, and the pain of a broken promise to his friend. How on earth could Peter come back from this? He had failed in his great desire to follow Jesus. I wonder what we would have done on that terrible night. The good news is that Peter did come back from this terrible night of failure to be renewed, but it didn't happen straight away. It took time. It took time for God to transform the deepest pain and hurt. Time to show people that God's love is greater than any human failure. It took time to show that God's love is greater than death. In the days that followed that terrible night, Jesus was cruelly tortured, crucified and died, buried, rose from the dead, came to his disciples in a locked room, stood on the seashore and gave advice to his disciples where to fish, cooked breakfast over an open fire for his friends. During that time, Peter had space to think. Peter went to the empty tomb and saw the folded linen clothes which had been wrapped around Jesus' body. Peter was in the locked room when Jesus gave his disciples a message of peace and told them to forgive. Peter had another terrible night, failing to catch fish. Peter then listened to the stranger's advice, fished in a different place, and caught a huge haul of fish. Peter jumped from the fishing boat into the water when he realized the stranger was his friend Jesus. Peter ate barbecued fish, cooked by Jesus. And then, on that marvelous morning, Peter had a conversation with Jesus which changed everything. One marvelous morning. I imagine that as Peter and Jesus started to talk, the smell of the charcoal fire brought back memories of Peter's terrible night. In the time since Jesus had been arrested, we can only wonder how often Peter had replayed the events of standing in the courtyard and denying his friend. We can only wonder what Peter wanted to say to Jesus. However, Jesus took the initiative in the conversation. Jesus focused on their relationship rather than Peter's broken words and misjudged actions. Jesus was all grace, compassion, and mercy. Jesus knew how much Peter loved him. Jesus knew Peter had made mistakes. Jesus had let Peter come to his own conclusions. Jesus did not accuse him, but did something far more powerful. He gave Peter the opportunity to be renewed because he believed in him. Do you love me? Jesus let Peter speak out and affirm his commitment to him. Yes, Peter was hurt that Jesus asked him 3 times how much he loved him, but it was a crucial, liberating moment to counterbalance the 3 times he had denied Jesus. Jesus demonstrated a powerful, sensitive way to restore their relationship. But Jesus did more than restore. He renewed Peter by giving him a purpose. He asked Peter to nurture and care for people like a shepherd cares for a flock of sheep. Peter was given the task of caring and enabling people to grow in their faith. Peter was commissioned by Jesus to lead a church in which lives were transformed. That marvelous morning was the start of Peter's renewed life. The book of Acts in the Bible records the stories of Peter's renewed life and the impact of his leadership in the early church. It's a really good read, and I encourage you to look at it perhaps for the first time or look at it again. But some highlights include Peter effectively told people about Jesus, and many people believed. Peter encouraged the church to be more inclusive, welcoming all people. People helped the church organize itself effectively so that people's skills could be used for maximum benefit. Peter put the power of forgiveness, reconciliation, and renewal he'd received from Jesus into action. And in the end, Peter's trust and love of God was so deep that he really did lay down his life for him. He put out his hands to be led by soldiers, to be crucified himself. On that marvelous morning on the beach, Jesus demonstrated that he believed in Peter despite his mistakes. He invited Peter to leave behind his old way of fishing and take up shepherding of people. Peter knew deep, deep down that he was accepted and his potential recognized. Jesus saw the potential in Peter. Jesus sees the potential in us. Jesus asks us to see the potential in others. Why, you may ask? God believes in us because God loves us. The question Jesus asked Peter is still very relevant today. Do you love me? Asked Jesus. Just a yes. However quiet our voices may be, however many questions we may have, is enough for God. Yes. Do you love me? Asked Jesus. Jesus asked Peter, who loved him, to follow him. Jesus asked us to follow his way and discover how to move forward. "Do you love me?" asked Jesus. A powerful message we can share as a church today is that we are a community who fail forward. We believe in God. We make mistakes, but we also know the power of forgiveness. We keep trusting God. We learn the power of reconciliation as we build honest, real, positive relationships with each other. We know we are loved by God and seek to live renewed lives. I am so very grateful that my mum believed in me. I am grateful that as I grew into an adult, employers, friends and family saw my potential and encouraged me to move on from my mistakes, learn and develop. I am grateful that Jesus is always inviting me and you to grow and be better versions of ourselves. Imagine how different the world could be if people genuinely had each other's best interests at heart. We can start with the people we encounter online, in person, at home, in our neighbourhood, at work, at our clubs, at church. If we are in God's business of transformation, who might we believe in this week? Who do we know needs our forgiveness so they can fail forward? What impact would our forgiveness have on them? What difference might it make if we value their potential? May God give us wisdom to build positive relationships this week. May we, with God's help, give people time, space, and lots of love to fail forward and be renewed. Amen.